All right, today we're looking at 1, 2 properties of real numbers. At the end of the day, you should be able to classify real numbers and also utilize and identify properties of real numbers. If we were in class right now, what I would have you do is kind of just start going through various numbers in a situation like this. Sorry, let me grab a different color here. So typically what would happen is I just have you start saying numbers on here. So we'd have somebody throw out a number like, 1. Somebody might say, -3. Somebody might say, just get creative, 7. You could do 0. You could do 4. 5. And then I would typically, at this point, we're not getting very creative with our numbers. So somebody might say, oh, how about 1/2? Okay. 1/2, we could say 4/3, something like that. And hopefully you're starting to see categories come together. Still haven't been super creative because we still have this blue box over to the side. And then somebody typically chimes in with the number pi. Or, square root of 2. Great example there. But then we have all this gray and purple space off to the side. Up to this point in math, you guys have only been concerned with the red, orange, yellow, green, blue boxes. These are all real numbers. Okay? And that's where your understanding of numbers have existed up to this point. But as we go throughout the year, what we're going to find out is not every answer in math has a real answer. It might have an answer like imaginary numbers. Like, we haven't been able to do the square root of -4 up to this point, but I can tell you the square root of -4 is 2i. It does exist, it's just not a real number. We'll talk about that more in chapter 5. Same, when we put real and imaginary numbers together, 2 plus 3i, for instance, this is a real number. This is an imaginary number. We put them together. That's called complex. Okay? So, the overarching category of all numbers is what we call complex numbers. Again, down here we have imaginary numbers. Imaginary. Okay? And then, like I said before, this box over here contains all of our real numbers. And then the real numbers, hopefully these next few words seem very familiar for you. Okay? We don't call the green box fractions. We actually call these rational numbers, which means the numbers in the blue box are called irrational. Basically, the word I want you to keep in mind is fractions. So rational numbers can always be represented as fractions. Irrational numbers cannot be represented as a fraction. Then we go into a subset of rational numbers. These are called integers. Integers are essentially all of our whole numbers, 0 on up, as well as their negative opposites. Okay? That means the orange box is whole numbers. Whole numbers are any rational number whose denominator is 1. And we obviously can start at 0 as well. They just don't contain any negatives. And then the last box is our natural numbers. Sorry, my writing's so horrible right there. But those are our natural numbers. Those are our counting numbers. Those are the first numbers you learned when you were a little tyke. All right, so today is going to be all about classifying. All right, so if we give you an example like -185, I would want you to list all the sets and subsets 185 is listed in. So I'll give you a second to think about that. And then we know 185 is an integer, which means it is also rational, which also means it's real. Okay. Right now, we're not worried. If you wanted to include complex, you could, but at this point, we're looking at properties and classifications of real numbers, so you don't have to worry about complex or imaginary at this point in the game. Square root of 95. Well, I know for one this is a real number. I also do know that it cannot be simplified as a fraction, which means it must be irrational. Square root of negative 49. Well, hopefully you guys see that square root of 49 is 7. So this just means negative 7. Negative 7 is a real number, which is also rational, and it is an integer. And then finally, D, negative 7/8. Well, hopefully you all notice that number 1, it is a real number, and number 2, it is a rational number. It is not an integer, it is not a whole number, it is not a natural number because the denominator is not 1. And that's how we classify real numbers. Again, our focus is going to be real, rational, integer, whole, natural, or irrational. We're not going to worry too much about complex or imaginary at this point. Okay? Last thing on today, you're going to be identifying properties of real numbers. All right, most of these you should already know. For instance, commutative, associative, those should be very familiar. Remember, commutative is 2 objects, and you just flip the order, whether it's addition or multiplication. Associative is 3 objects, and then you switch the order in which you add or multiply. Distributive property, again, is another one we've talked about where you should be very familiar with. It can be right or left distributive. Either way, you're distributing the a to both terms in that instance. These next 3 might be relatively new for you, but you should know identity. Identity, remember, you start and finish with the same number. You start and finish with the same number. That's a little bit different than inverse, because inverse, we either finish with 0 or 1. So identity, you start with a number, you finish with the number. Inverse, you start with a number, and then you finish with either 0 or 1, depending on whether it's addition or multiplication. And then the last property, this is probably going to be the new one for you. It's called closure. Closure just means that when we add 2 numbers together, it's a real number. Or when we multiply 2 numbers together, it's a real number. It's not like it disappears and becomes imaginary all of a sudden. Okay? But those are the few properties that you'll have to identify. So to kind of give you an example, it might be something like 2 plus 3 equals 3 plus 2. And then your answer would be identify, or the question is identify the property. So you'd be like, oh my gosh, that is the addition commutative property. My writing is absolutely horrible right now on this iPad. Awesome. All right. So again, homework's on the bottom of the page. Please pay attention to Schoology because sometimes assignments may change, especially between distance, hybrid, whatever we might be doing. So please, please, please do the assignment listed on Schoology. Let me know if you have any questions.